Welcome to Real Estate 360 Live with Ryan Sloper, the trusted name in real estate radio. Now, here's Ryan Sloper.
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Real Estate 360 Live. I'm your host, Ryan Sloper. For those of you not familiar with the podcast, my guest and I will cover every angle of real estate under the sun, from interest rates to the economy to what's happening in Washington. We will give you the nitty-gritty details of what you need to know as far as mortgage interest rates, what's taking place with the Fed and the federal fund rate and the stimulus, QE, the taper of QE. We'll talk about the implications of the mortgage markets and whether they're going to tighten or loosen credit standards and what that means for home prices, what that means for interest rates. We're going to tell you not what you want to hear, but what you need to hear in order to make more educated, informed decisions. If you haven't already, you can go to the iTunes store and you can subscribe or download directly from iTunes. If you search there, Real Estate 360, you can subscribe and download, and we'd love for you to share with other people that you feel might get something from this podcast. Also, any questions that you may have, you can also go to the site, and you can also stream the shows live at Real Estate 360 Live. That's realestate360live.com. On that site, on the right-hand side, there's an Ask a Question button for any questions that you may have. It's very helpful for us because if there's things that you guys would like to know or get answers to, we'd be glad to talk about a lot of your questions on future episodes. So make sure you check that out at realestate360live.com. Joining me on our panel, as he does each and every week, to discuss the many topics, is Louis Camerosano. Louis is a former school teacher, a former attorney, and a former general manager of a major real estate portal. He's been cited in the media as a real estate industry expert in the Boston Globe, Inman News, Wall Street Journal, Forbes, Smart Money, Market Watch, and numerous others. How you doing today, Louis?
I'm doing splendid, Ryan. How are you?
I'm doing well. So, the last time we left off talking, we talked about a lot of loosening credit standards for Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. I kind of went into great detail. I mean, first quarter, there was probably about 40% of all transactions in the United States were cash transactions, which for you and I, it signals that the majority of that is just investor-based buying, not near as much first-time home buyers, which I believe the first-time home buyer count the last time I checked was somewhere around the 20% neighborhood, which tells you
29%, I think, Ryan.
Was it 29%?
Yeah, okay, it's been fluctuating between 28 and 30%, which is an all-time low.
Okay, so we'll say below a third of all the transactions are going to first-time home buyers. When
less.
One would hope that in an economy that's recovering, that those would be closer to probably around 50%, because that would signal that the job market's good. People that are graduating from college are finding jobs, and they're wanting to enter into the housing market, but that's just not the case. It's not what we have. We talked in great detail about, what happens if you start to loosen the guidelines. They were so worried for the last 3 years about implementing this regulation to really, get the mortgage markets under control, to not let them give out loans that were potentially very risky. They had a lot of fees that were imposed so that Fannie and Freddie could make money, basically hand over fist for government to control of Fannie and Freddie, and they've been making money. And now at this point where it looks like people are no longer qualifying for loans, and which then has the effect that they can't buy houses, they've now said, hey, guess what? We're going to loosen things back up. We think that it's very important for people to buy houses, and we're going to do what we need to do to make that happen, i.e., we're going to, lower credit score requirements, probably lower down payment requirements, not have the same buybacks for lenders that are giving out loans, so they're not going to be as responsible for what they lend out. And I want to talk because after we had our last conversation, Lois, I actually talked to another mortgage guy who the mortgage company was somehow tied into with a hedge fund. And it was very interesting to listen to him talk because a lot of what I spoke about the other day, remember about having a common sense approach to underwriting, they actually are doing. They've actually been doing for about 6 months now. And one of the products that he mentioned to me was a product for self-employed borrowers. Now, it's not a stated income loan, but the only thing that it requires is 1 year tax returns instead of 2. So if it was a business, they're only requiring 1 year's tax return, so they don't have to average out the last 2 years. So if somebody had a good year the last year and it's documented on their tax return, self-employed borrowers, that is, they can qualify for the same conventional loans that they're giving out to other people. And let's take that a step further. There's FHA loans that they'll go down to a 580 score. Even if there's a lot of dings on the credit, they don't necessarily care. If there's somebody that's willing to not necessarily co-sign, but let them add their name to another account, like a bank account, then with assets, like let's just say there's 12 months reserve in assets, and the person can just add their name to an account as the secondary account holder, and they could have actually no authority over that account other than, they're just there. But that gives them a reason they could still potentially get an FHA loan down with 3.5% down payment. So after speaking with him, he's like, really, they've given me all authority. And when he says all authority, the way it's tied into hedge fund, it's basically, it seems like money that's from these hedge funds is now flowing back into the mortgage market, and they're giving him control and to oversee the underwriting process. And if a loan makes sense, then they're going to do it. This is pretty much what I felt was going to happen, was they were going to have to move towards a platform. And even Fannie and Freddie, I think that's what we're going to start to see. All these lenders are going to start doing loans on a more common sense basis, because if they don't, the mortgage market will continue to tank, home sales will tank, and we would really see, I think, price declines relatively fast. If they start to implement this, Lewis, we kind of talked how far can they push this thing out, kick the can down the road, as we always talk about. This would buy them a little bit of time. How much, I don't know, but I'm sure you've been paying attention, Lewis, that interest rates have actually been getting better. They've been getting better when we think
lower.
That lower. And we thought that at some point, they would start to move back the other way. All the economists, everybody was predicting that they would go back the other way. We have a lot of unrest overseas, and much of what the Fed talked about in their minutes is they're more paying attention to what's going overseas and instead of paying attention to what's going on here at the home front. Want to get your overall thoughts on what's taking place, and where do you think we're headed?
Well, I was focused this week on the job numbers and the existing home sales, and the initial jobless claim, as you know, I don't place a lot of faith in as being an indicator as to how healthy the job market is, especially because the labor participation rate is down, which means there's fewer people in the job market. So I think that when fewer people lose their jobs in any given week, it doesn't mean that more people are going to get jobs in the coming days ahead. And we did have an initial jobless claim number this week, which was higher than expected. It was 326,000. It's been about that level, 300,000 plus, for the last couple of years, and we haven't seen any improvement in the job market. And that just means you have over 1.2, 1.3 million people losing their jobs each and every week and applying for unemployment benefits. But yet, somehow, the media and the Fed are saying that the job market is firming. And to give you a quick example, the Associated Press came out and said applications for U.S. unemployment benefits rise to 326,000, though remain at low level. They have to throw that kind of editorializing in. Reuters, same thing. Jobless claims rise, but still close to pre-recession levels. And this, to me, is just the type of spin that we're hearing about the labor market, that somehow it's getting better. And we know most of the jobs that are being created are part-time. Wages are flat. Excuse me. But people losing their jobs each week as the workforce is shrinking, it's not good news. Now, we also had, Ryan, the housing number come in. And as you know, the first quarter, the home sales have been down year over year, and then also from the prior months before. So we've had a steady decline in the amount of existing home sales and also a decline in new home sales. Well, and that was chalked up to the weather. We had a very horrible polar vortex in the first quarter, and just people could not buy homes. Well, the number came out for April, and it was down year over year about 7%. And however, it was up from March. So what are the headlines? Blurt, Reuters, housing sector turning the corner and job market firming. Existing home sales rebound, inventory increases. USA Today, spring arrives and housing market as sales rise. Wall Street Journal, existing home sales rise for the first time this year. Los Angeles Times, existing home sales rise in April for the first time this year. So again, they're pointing off the law of small numbers. Yes, March was a horrible month. February was bad. January was bad. They managed to rise 1% over the months before, and they're trumpeting it as the arrival of spring. The winter is over. The housing market recovery continues apace. The Fed does the same thing. You have, remember with Charles Plosser, the Philadelphia Reserve, last week we talked about, he said just because housing starts are slower and sales are slower, that doesn't mean the market's weak, because that's not consistent with the continued increase in prices. I'm not panicking about the housing market. Well, then this week he says, regardless of the impact of the weather it's had on the economy, the stiff winter weather with snowstorms and frigid temps affected every aspect of the economy, but the economy is on firmer footing. The fundamentals of the housing market remain sound, including stronger household formation, solid job growth, and consumers with stronger balance sheets. None of that is true. We haven't seen, as you and I talked about at the beginning of the show, millennials are not forming households at any particularly great rate. The job growth is not solid. And we've seen in the last few months, consumers don't have stronger balance sheets, Ryan. They have been increasing their household debt while inflation is going higher. So we don't really have this recovery at all in housing. And you know who knows that are the investors, because BlackRock, who has been buying a lot of these homes, as an investor, the CEO, Laurence Fink, said last week that the housing market is structurally more unsound than prior to the financial crisis due to its reliance on Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. So it makes no sense that you have the media and the Fed out there trumpeting recovery. The average guy on the street can see that it isn't there. They see who's buying the houses. It's investors, and that those investors who are buying the houses are saying that it's not a good market. And yet you have this recovery story continuing, because we had a 1% increase in April in existing home sales from March, which is a very dismal month. And the only one spot I did see Fed President Charles Dudley from New York, he says there's a deep and protracted housing downturn. Now, what I want to get your take on, Ryan, is Plosser has been a hawk. He has always wanted to get rid of QE. He's never liked QE. Dudley has been a dove, and he loves QE. So do you think that there's some connection between their views on where things are going, i.e. Plosser is saying everything is fine, everything I read to you about how he thinks the housing market is great, consumers are doing great, well, that leads to stop QE. Dudley is saying, whoa, hold on a minute. Housing's not doing fine, more QE. So do you think there's some internal tension building now as to whether they should continue to taper?
I do. I mean, I think that I would love to be a fly on the wall in these meetings, right? Because as you mentioned, it was what are the questions that are being thrown out there? What are they actually discussing? Because they obviously don't want to pay attention to the real numbers, right? They want to look at inflation numbers, stripping out energy and the most important things that are driving up the inflation number, that the real inflation number. They don't want to look at that. Yeah, they don't want to look at that number. They don't want to look at the real employment. They don't care about the unemployment rate. They really don't care about the labor participation rate either. They look at housing. Janet Yellen was out in her speech at NY University, Lewis, and she basically was telling people that, expect failure and learn from it was essentially her message there. And she went into talking about how they brainstormed and designed a host of programs that were going to, keep the financial systems going, and then went on to backstop everything Bernanke did, essentially saying that, he faced, I think her quote is, he faced relentless criticism, personal threats, and the certainty that history would judge him harshly if he were wrong. But he stood up for what he believed was right and necessary. Ben Bernanke's intelligence and knowledge served him well as chairman. Now, for her to come back and to really push Bernanke as the moves he made, pretty much is setting the stage to me for her to be able to come back and do this for a second time, right?
If need be, yes.
Exactly, and to credit, to give a lot of credit to the things that he's done. When in reality, you and I said that everything that he really did as far as keeping interest rates low for an extended period of time is very detrimental to the overall economy. And then you have,
and how he did it through QE by printing money. It wasn't just keeping rates low; it was by supposedly buying Treasuries and mortgage-backed securities that would keep rates low, and now they've stopped buying them and rates are still low. So that begs the question, how are they still low? But that's a separate issue. Continue with your thought. I'm sorry.
No, and by buying these Treasuries and mortgage-backed securities and keeping interest rates low for an extended period of time actually was really driving the stock market. It was never driving housing. It was never really doing what they wanted it to do.
Or claimed they wanted it to do.
Right, or claimed they wanted it to do. And we've got all these, different news outlets out there reporting whatever they really care to. But the reality is that housing outside of investors is pretty much not been anything to write home about at all. And we have, Plotzer saying everything's fine and Dudley saying everything is not fine. So, yeah, I think there's got to be something that's got to give, because at some point somebody's going to say, look, I don't know how much longer we can keep this up, because, somebody's going to be on to us at this point. You brought up an interesting point before we came on the show, which was, who's buying these treasuries? Who's buying these mortgage-backed securities? If we continue to taper off and nobody's really saying, okay, well, who's out there, who's buying them that's actually keeping these interest rates kind of suppressed where at almost, we're going back to all-time lows again. So who's the one that's buying it? If it's not the U.S. and it's not completely Belgium, who is doing it? Because that would be a question that I would really be interested, because I want to dig deeper and say, okay, well, why in the world would you want to buy U.S. Treasuries? Why in the world would you want to buy U.S. mortgage-backed securities when there's really no yield to be had? And if you want to say, okay, we're the lesser of the evils because we don't have like some sort of international crisis going on the home front right now, like there's going on in Ukraine and Russia, that's fine. But I just don't see it, Lewis. I don't see why. And I'm sure you've seen a lot of the interviews lately with Dr. Ben Carson, who's out there been really pushing lately with his new book. And he talks about one of the things that is, he feels is the most pressing issue is our national deficit, right? Well, who wants to talk about our national deficit, Lewis? Really?
We used to talk about it. If you remember, Ryan, when we started our show on CBS 3-4 years ago, that was an issue. People were concerned about the debt. And I guess that's gone away because nothing has, quote, happened. They've had these debt ceiling issues. And since they now don't have the debt ceiling issue anymore because they've now agreed never to fight over that anymore and just raise it, I guess people think it's gone away when actually it's gotten worse since we started talking about it, because the unfunded liabilities and the actual deficit have increased and are increasing, and nothing's been done about it whatsoever. And having foreigners buy our debt was, at one point, kind of our solution. We had a lot of foreigners buying our debt, China and Japan in particular, and they've slowed their purchases. Some have started to dump their purchases. The Fed is stopping buying mortgage-backed securities and U.S. Treasuries, and they were 70-80% of the market last year and earlier this year. But yet we still issue Treasuries at the same rate, and it seems, as we talked about at the beginning of the show, Ryan, Belgium is buying them, and the question still remains, where is Belgium getting the money to buy 120 billion U.S. Treasuries when they're basically spending 2/3 of their yearly GDP on U.S. Treasuries? It doesn't make any sense. The people of Belgium should want to know, why would they be buying Treasuries? Isn't there something else they can put the reserves in? And do they really even have that many reserves at 120 billion to buy in just 4 or 5 months? So not only do we have a debt issue, the question is, how is it even being financed? Because taxes only cover, the reason you have debt is because your expenditures exceed the revenues you get from taxes, and that rest of it has to be funded by issuing debt, which up to now, most of it's been funded by the Fed has purchased $4 trillion worth of U.S. Treasuries and mortgage-backed securities, so they probably funded about $2.5 trillion worth of the debt and only got about $1 trillion worth of GDP growth. So the debt hasn't even produced a return. It's just increased the overall size of the debt. So who is going to continue to fund our debt? And the only way I see out of it is you have to stop the spending. You can't just keep increasing the debt because there's no appetite for that debt. But yet
Correct.
we see Belgium as this big buyer, and no one is asking the question. That would be one of the first questions I ask if I was a reporter. Well, you're tapering. Interest rates are going lower, which must mean somehow somebody else is buying the Treasuries to keep the interest rates low and keep the demand for the Treasuries high. Who's buying them? And where are they getting the money from?
Well, there's one thing that I think we can probably both agree on in this economy for the last 4 or 5 years, and with the Fed intervention that we've had, is we can expect the unexpected, right? There's always something that's popping up out of nowhere. Because
we predicted, Ryan, if this happened, if the Fed stopped buying Treasuries because they were 70-80% of the market, that interest rates would have to rise. They haven't, because it seems
they've actually gone down.
They've gone down because as the Fed has stopped buying, Belgium has actually bought more than the Fed is not buying.
Right.
So there's been an increase in demand through Belgium to more than compensate for the decrease in purchases of the Fed's taper.
So the question is, has the Fed now gone back to the president and said, hey, look, we're doing everything we possibly can, and it's not enough. And that's why the Congress has now basically gone back, to Fannie and Freddie and said, okay, looks like we need to change our game plan. Let's scratch the whole regulation crap and try to really get this money back out there to the public like we should have probably been doing from the jump. Because
maybe they should have been scrapping the regulations on the employers so they would hire more people so people would have jobs and they can buy houses, rather than having a lousy economy and then try to force the people to overpay for homes that they've generated artificially high.
Correct.
They manipulated artificially high.
Well, the root, they never address the root of the problem, right?
Correct.
They think that they feel like if they just have low interest rates, that's enough to turn the economy around. But, Economics 101 would tell you that, okay, well, it's important for somebody to have a steady wage before they can actually get a loan, regardless of what the interest rates are. And since that hasn't been the case, since there's a lack of jobs, and the jobs that are out there are part-time work for the majority, where people are working 2 or 3 jobs, it's not feasible for people to buy, regardless of its 1% rate, 2%, 3%, 4%, 5%, or 10%. It doesn't do a lick of good if you don't have a job that's paying you consistently and a decent enough wage for it to make sense. So it's comical that they sit around and they have these meetings and they don't talk about the basic stuff. But I feel like it's almost, I've been getting pretty good about trying to see where things are going, and it's almost like they're running out of ammunition, as I always talk about, Lewis. And what more can they do? They get interest rates back into the low 3%. That's still not going to change. It might slightly change the numbers a little bit because you might see an uptick in refinances real quick.
Right.
You will get a temporary boost, which then they'll be able to see, hey, look, everything's getting better again.
Right. But wasn't it amazing, though, that they even managed to keep the interest rates this low, which shows, or at least gives the impression, how powerful they are. They can just, quote, say, we're going to keep interest rates low, when actually something had to happen behind the scenes in order to find a buyer, because that was our big concern last year, why they couldn't taper, who's going to buy the Treasuries. We found the buyer. We don't know the circumstances behind the buyer, and yet it's in plain view, hiding there. 120, 30, 40, $50 billion worth of securities have been purchased by Belgium. And we don't know who it is or why it is. And if it is Belgium, it doesn't make a stitch of sense how they can come up with that kind of money. If it's the ECB, as you and I talked about at the beginning of the show, then how come the ECB isn't saying, we believe it's a good idea to buy U.S. Treasuries. It helps lower the cost of the euro versus the dollar, which is good for our exports. We think it's a good investment. That would be a nice thing to do if they wanted to say that. They're not saying that. And no one's asking the question.
It'd be nice if we could actually get that question answered, because I'd be curious as to what they would say. You know what I mean? It doesn't make any sense.
Belgium can't afford to buy $140 billion worth of treasuries in 4 months. It's their entire GDP almost. It doesn't make any sense.
And unless the Federal Reserve is actually lending them money to buy the same stuff. You know what I mean? I don't know. They've got to be doing something. They've got to be giving them the money. I don't know how.
Someone has to be giving them the money, whoever them is. They're listed as Belgium. If it's the Fed, then they should disclose that. Of course, you can't disclose that because they basically would be saying we're tapering, but in order to replace the taper, we're going to print the money and send it to Belgium. That wouldn't make any sense. And in a way, you think maybe that isn't what's happening. Something is happening. And, of course, the Fed is aware of what's happening. Either they're orchestrating it, they're doing it directly, or they know about it. Someone knows about it. It's not like it's a big secret, because if you were in government and that popped up on your screen, you'd want to know what's going on. Who owns all this debt of ours?
Right.
Because one of the problems we've always had is we've known that China holds sway over us because they own $1 trillion, over $1.2 trillion worth of U.S. Treasuries. We've been very cognizant of that fact, and it factors into our trade relations and our entire geopolitical stance with China. Well, now we have to deal with Belgium? It doesn't make any sense.
No, it doesn't. We've got, and it drives me insane to read many of the headlines that you've listed off at the beginning of the show, and then all these surveys that are done. There was another survey done, and this is a survey that's done every quarter. It's the Home Price Expectation Survey done by Pulsonomics. It surveys a panel of I think it's like over 100 economists, real estate experts, and investment market strategists over where the prices are headed over the next 5 years, okay? And then they average all those projections. Well, the result of their latest survey that home values will appreciate by 4.4% in 2014. The cumulative appreciation will be 19.5% by 2018. The means, the average annual appreciation will be 3.6% over the next 5 years. And the experts were making up the most bearish quartile of the survey, still projecting a cumulative appreciation of 9.4% by 2018. And many are saying that they believe that the survey is a fair depiction of future values. Well, they have to only be basing this data off of, they feel like the Fed and everything else is going to stay in line for the next 4 plus. Right? I mean, because where else do you come up with these numbers? You have to assume that you're going to have basically 3 to 4% interest rates. You're going to have to assume that basically Fannie and Freddie and everybody else is going to loosen loan guidelines, because if all those things don't happen, you cannot have price appreciation because the jobs aren't there. So that's the only way that this could happen.
And what about interest rates, Ryan? We had inflation numbers. They were kind of dusted under the table, if we talked about last week. The producer price index was up 0.6%. The consumer price index was 0.3%, and that's after you exclude the near double-digit increases over 1 month of food and energy. So the baseline numbers, the CPI and the PPI, have already reached the Fed's so-called target inflation rate of 2%, at which point they're supposed to raise rates, just like when unemployment got below 6.5%. So they've already hit their targets, and yet they're talking about keeping rates low for an extended period after they finish tapering. But what if inflation takes off to officially to 2, 3, 4, 5%, which really means it's 10, 12, 15%? Are they not going to raise rates to try to combat that?
Well,
they won't, and they can't.
Well, I don't know if you saw, but I think that one of the things that that Yellen had brought up was how could they potentially tighten a little bit without actually having to touch that Fed fund rate, right? Because I think what you're talking about, I think that they see that. I think that they do know that inflation rate's getting out of control a little bit. They're not going to acknowledge that to the media or anybody else, but I think they know. They have to. They have to see food and gas prices and everything else, and how that.
They're temporary, though, Ryan.
Well, I mean, they can say that they're temporary, Lewis, but you know that they're not completely dumb. They're just dumb when they talk to the media, right?
Yeah, of course.
So it's just what they're very picky with what they say. They choose their words very carefully when they craft these messages, so that when the media writes their stories, they're writing them with the slant that the Federal Reserve wants.
Right.
And they're,
well, the Federal Reserve wants people to think that inflation is a good thing. That's why they're targeting it.
Correct.
And that's what we saw last week with Bullard saying he's optimistic we can reach our inflation targets and make people pay more for goods and services when their wages aren't going higher.
Yeah, and in the same breath, Yellen is out there really promoting where she wants to do things to help the employment situation. She wants us to get back to full employment. Well,
inflation doesn't help that.
No, it doesn't help that, and government regulation doesn't help that. But yet we'd rather hammer home the point of people are pushing for $15 minimum wage. Now, Louis, and this is the problem with our country in general. I mean, we already have a ridiculous problem with the employment situation now, and now we want to talk about raising the minimum wage because that's all of a sudden going to help employment. Do you want to see unemployment double? Because that's the first way that it would double.
Of course, Ryan, when you think about $15, and this is the question that the people that are in favor of minimum wage, also the people that are in favor of inflation, is they have these numbers. 2% is good inflation. All right, why not 10%? Why not 20%? It's not good to have inflation. Same as minimum wage. 15% is good. $15 an hour is good. So if you tell them, well, how about $30 an hour? How about $100? Let's just eliminate poverty and make it $300. That's ridiculous. Well, why is $15? It's not a market-driven number. It's a number you picked out. So why can't anyone just pick out any number? They all seem, the economists agree, 2% inflation is what you need, and $15 an hour in minimum wage. How do they know?
Well, you know what? If they think like the Fed does, I mean, I guess they're just numbers, right? They can just pull numbers out just like the Fed can. What does it matter? 1 billion, 1 trillion? You know what I mean?
Right.
I guess it's really irrelevant, and that's more or less what we turn to at this point.
Well, what they say is economists say.
Right.
What track record does an economist say? If an employer tells you something, and it's somebody who's hired hundreds or thousands of people, and they tell you in their experience and what they project will happen if you raise the minimum wage, they discard that. Oh, people won't do that.
Right.
And if they do that, the government will regulate and make sure they won't do that.
Well,
you saw what they said with the Obamacare. The employer has to sign something when they fire somebody that it wasn't because of the increased Obamacare costs. Which means they recognize that people will fire people because of increased costs. Same thing with if they instituted a minimum wage of $15 after the employer said we'd have to fire people. Well, they'd make you not fire people and say you'd have to sign something that if you are firing somebody, it isn't because you had to pay them $15.
Right. Well, you know what? You brought up a very good point, and this is something I wanted to touch on the last show. So Obamacare, right? I don't know if you've been paying attention to this, but I mean, like when I get on Facebook every once in a blue moon, I see at least 20 posts in there about you won't believe this. My premiums just got changed. I went from $700 to $1,300 or $1,400. Now, what do you think the overall effect of just the healthcare cost increases on real estate? Discretionary
on the economy. Ryan, I'm paying hundreds of dollars more with a deductible. It's like $8,000.
Yeah, and that's only going to get
So
worse.
I don't have the same amount of money at all extra. It puts me in deficit.
Absolutely, and that puts almost majority of people in a deficit. There's only a few people that are out there that actually can claim that they're like saving money, and they're probably they're probably older, and because the young are paying for the old. And
right. Look at housing. If housing has gone up or your rent has gone up, food is rising, healthcare costs are rising, and if you have a kid in school, education costs are rising. How is there no inflation and your wages aren't rising? And then you're going to buy a house after you have an extra $200, $300, $400, $500 in payments that you have to make for healthcare insurance.
Well, that's what I said. Just with the healthcare increases, wouldn't you say that's probably like a 20% inflation just with that? You know what I mean? Because I mean,
and it's mandatory. You can't even say, well, I'll forego that.
Right. Yeah, I don't want it. I'll just pay the fine.
Well, actually, you are economically better off at least this year doing that, unless you have a serious injury, then you're not. But in terms of monthly payments, the fine is cheaper. The way they were able to make it constitutional was to say that it was a tax, even though nothing was in the healthcare law that said it was a tax, but Justice Roberts said it was a tax because the fine wouldn't be that high. So there's a little gift there. If you don't want to buy the insurance, you pay the fine. But I think over the course of years, what happens is the fine gets increasingly higher, so then it makes sense to buy the insurance. But either way, the point is, most people are going to buy the insurance, and they're going to pay more for it, and they're going to have less money in their pocket.
Yep, and most people have, or not most people, but a majority of families out there, it's not just, the husband and the wife, it's kids and everybody else. They're not going to want their kids to not have, medical care. And so rising costs, let's just say that for somebody it went from $700 a month to $1,200 or $1,300 a month.
Typical,
right?
Which is a typical thing you hear.
Right. So that's about $600 extra money that they would probably have been spending on groceries or something else, which the cost of those things are going up. So
right.
You literally are going to be into a situation where people are going to have to pick up another job on top of what they're currently doing just to be able to have money to put into a savings account.
And you know what you can't do anymore, Ryan? A lot of people would send their spouse out to get a job just to get insurance. And now employers aren't offering that.
Right.
It used to be you can get a job. It didn't have to be a great job. You get a job with a normal employer. I say normal employer that has a decent size. You would get on their health care plan, and you can add your spouse and your family. Even if the job didn't pay much, at least it was valuable because it had health care insurance. You can't get that anymore. Most of the jobs they're offering are part-time, so they're not going to offer you health care insurance.
Yeah, you figure, even if the employer offers a plan, even if the majority of who's paying the plan is the worker, you give them a $30,000 job or whatever, and before you know it, they're not bringing home really anything after they have to pay out their family's health insurance premiums out of that. You know what I mean?
Right. If they even will offer it.
Correct. And so what's so crazy about this person you're talking health insurance, and on the flip side, they're going to talk about $15 minimum wage. We have bigger fish to fry. Like, can we take care of getting rid of the first asinine problem with the healthcare premiums, and then worry about getting people back to work and getting our economy, get rid of our national deficit, get rid of all these things. Let interest rates rise back up so there's more competition and actually a more free-flowing market. Can we do some of these things maybe?
Rather than interfering with the free market labor, I'd be more in favor of they already have all this money earmarked for food stamps and assistance. It's better to do that than to create more unemployed and then to have even more people on assistance because you're raising the minimum wage.
Right.
The part of the economy that works is the part that hires people and actually generates tax revenue.
Right.
To interfere with that makes no sense. It's far better than it's far better to take care of the people with government funds that have already been extracted for the unemployed or the people who don't have enough and need food stamps. But to create more people in that dependency because you raise the minimum wage doesn't make any sense at all.
No. At what point does somebody say that, okay, this system is so broken? Or
no one looks at it as a system. People look at it as an individual need on a case-by-case basis. And so that's why these issues become kind of, people galvanize around one issue and they push them through. Even though it creates an entire system that doesn't make a stitch of sense and nobody wants. Yeah, everyone wants what they want out of the system. They don't want a better system.
Well, yeah, because it's really hard to believe that you could go in and you could actually fix the entire system, and it would have the trickle down effect. Like you could actually go in, you could actually stop buying mortgage-backed securities and treasuries. You could pull that back. You could basically just put lending standards to a normal level where you have common underwriting standards that if it makes sense for somebody to get a loan, they get a loan. If you actually started forcing Congress to cut the deficit, and it has to be cut in increments over 10 years, it must be down to a certain percentage. If you did
starting with the first year, because what they do, Ryan, is they start it in Congress is 3 and 5 years out, which they never do.
Correct. Right, and then they run into the problem of, oh, we were getting ready to start that, but now it looks like we have troubling economic times, and we need to boost the economy with infrastructure and all these other things, right? So yeah, they always have a reason for doing that, and that's it's the biggest joke. But it's like, unfortunately, the best way that there is to get out of this is to go through that short-term pain. Last
time that happened was in the 80s when you had a restructuring of the economy. Was with Ronald Reagan, Reaganomics, where he put his presidency on the line and allowed the Volcker to raise interest rates, and then he also put in massive tax cuts. But he didn't put in the corresponding spending cuts, but still, that did boost the economy for years after it went through the Depression. We haven't had a restructuring like that since. We've papered over every problem since then.
Now,
starting with his increase of the deficit. We've just added to the deficit.
Okay, so that brings me to the next question. Do you think it's a possibility for the next potential president to come in and do something of that sort, or do you think that it's a higher likelihood that Hillary comes in and just keeps the party going?
The latter. There was a chance, but Romney wasn't the guy, that, you had the analogy of the Jimmy Carter, President Obama, where someone would come in after one term of Obama and really restructure. And there was kind of hints of it with the Tea Party wins in 2010, but they never gained the majority to put through the spending cuts that they wanted to put through. But if you had a president in 2012 who was more of that ilk and then brought along more congressmen and senators, and you had a majority, and I guess it would have to have been Republican, but if you had that type of president, and Romney was not that type of president. He did Romneycare and Obamacare, so he wasn't looking to repeal that, even though he said he was. I'm sure he wouldn't have done it. But if you had a president who would come in with the full support of the Congress, Senate, and Congress to put in spending cuts, to lower taxes, to reduce regulation, the economy would have fallen off a cliff for a while, but it would have restructured. Instead of increasing the number of people on food stamps, you would increase the labor participation rate. You'd put people back to work, and the economy would get better. Instead, what we're doing is we're spending more and more money trying to patch up the economy by paying or lowering standards so people can buy houses, and we're not really making progress in job and wage growth at all. We just have a rising stock market. That's the only thing. The difference between Carter and Obama, Carter didn't have a rising stock market.
Right.
He had the bad economy, and he didn't have a good housing market. And that's what they think has helped the economy. And it's actually kept Obama in office because he was able to say the unemployment. Remember during the election, the unemployment rate went down it was below 8%. So he was able to say when he took office, it was near 10, and now it was heading down. He'll be able to say when he leaves office, it went from 10% to 5.5%.
Right, and Hillary will be able to come in and say, hey, look where we've gotten in the last 4 years, right?
Right. Do you want to go back to the Bush period when it was exactly?
Yeah, and it's really sick when you think about, the United States Congress and the Fed, what they've done. And if you look at it at the most basic level, they're basically coming out and saying, well, it's okay for us to essentially just they don't have to go bankrupt because they have a printing press. But for the average American, they're forced into bankruptcy. They're forced to restructure, right?
Right.
You're forced to restructure and start over. But for some reason, the U.S. is above the average individual that's in this country. They don't have to restructure because
they don't even have to have Obamacare. They have their own health care plan.
Right. It's they have their own set of standards that is completely unfair. But yet, when people look at things for face value, it's just like, well, I assume that the government's still, spending and they're telling us that everything's okay. Well, you know what? I'm going to live above my means and I'm going to keep throwing things back on credit cards. The thing that I told myself I wasn't going to do 5 years ago when everything hit the fan the last time, they're right back into the same situation. And it's mainly to me a byproduct of what the overall economy and country is doing. I mean, nobody, if they would change their philosophy and approach, the masses would follow suit, which would be a smart thing to do. But we don't do what's the smart thing.
Well, you're right, Ryan. You don't have a leader who is saying who's setting the tone. Forget the
Correct.
policies. The president isn't saying. And if you remember what Jimmy Carter did, he tried to set the tone, and didn't work, of austerity. He said, turn your thermostats down, drive less. And Reagan came in and said, forget that. We need to consume. We need to save. But the point was both presidents were trying to set an economic tone of what they think might work. Obama's tone is he's not really setting anything other than he's complaining that rich people have too much money and we don't have enough for the poor and we don't have enough jobs. But he's not saying, he's stating it as an injustice rather than as a policy.
Absolutely. And
what are you supposed to do about it?
Well, and what did he
wanted to raise taxes. That was his answer, if you remember, on the wealthiest. That was his big, he wasn't going to give on that. As if that was going to fix anything. And he's actually said, in a debate with Hilary Clinton, he doesn't even care if raising taxes on the wealthy ends up being tax neutral or negative, meaning that as a result, the government makes less money because of that. He says because it's fair. So his interest is in just creating fairness. It's not being a steward of the economy and creating growth.
Absolutely. And you know what? And the reason why I actually said that, I will admit that Obama and his team, they're marketing geniuses, because what they did was they created a movement amongst Americans and this class warfare. They created, his marketing pitch was hope and change, Lewis. Hope
right, but
and
now
change.
it's complain, and that's
right.
it. And if you complain, at least you have Obama on your side. He'll listen to you complaining, but he's not saying, I'm going to fix it.
Correct.
He's going to fight against the people who have the money, but it doesn't do you any good.
Right.
It's never worked to go after rich people. You're not going to get their money, and then, because even if you got it and gave it to everybody, it would be gone within a year.
And the rationale is crazy anyway, Lewis. If they have all the money, wouldn't you work side by side with them to help create jobs, right? Do things that is going to be beneficial for the overall economy. Instead, they rather, because you know what? The majority of the people they fall in the 99%. They don't fall in that 1%. So it's easier to just go after those votes and to create this class warfare where the rich hate the poor, or the poor hate the rich, really, not vice versa.
When it comes down to it, nobody really wants to change anything. They want to get reelected, and they want the power. I don't care what anyone says. Their primary purpose is, don't think for a minute Obama doesn't love being president, flying around on that jet, saluting people, taking vacations, and being the president. And he will do whatever it is to. And that's not a cut on him. That's any politician. Very few are in it for the service. They're in it for the personal aggrandizement. And if they actually have to do something that might prevent them from getting reelected, they're not going to do it.
So do you feel like I can kind of see Ben Carson's kind of the potential type candidate that would speak up against the masses? Will he be labeled as an extremist and just won't be able to get on a ticket because of that?
There's anybody like that. If you remember, Reagan was considered an extremist because he came from the Goldwater wing of the Republican Party. Reagan was only able to overcome that because he was a once-in-a-lifetime charismatic figure. I don't know if Ben Carson has those, and it's not a cut against him, those charismatic qualities. He may say all the right things, but it takes a lot more. And if you think about even Ross Perot, same kind of guy, they managed to cut him back too and marginalize him. It's very hard for somebody to break the establishment unless they truly are a unique individual, not from their views, but in their ability to communicate them.
Right.
And that's really what you don't have, because that's why you get Bush and Clinton for 2016. Neither of those candidates are charismatic, people love, would do anything for, believe they're right for the country. People have just been conditioned to think, well, yeah, Hilary Clinton, she's an amazing woman. I can't tell you why, but she is. And Jeb Bush, well, his father was president and his brother was president, and that's about it.
Right.
And so as long as, and those two candidates will toe the party line, they're not going to cut spending. They're not going to change much. They're going to make sure they get themselves elected for two more terms, initially, and then one more term.
Right.
So and I don't think it changes with the president. It has to change at the local level and bubble up. There has to be a movement. And you've had these little movements. You've had Occupy Wall Street. You've had Tea Party movements. It's very difficult for them to break through on the national level because the Republicans and Democrats have these leadership committees where they won't even allow the Tea Party, which was at one point pretty large, to kind of take over their party. They'll change the rules. They did it back to Teddy Roosevelt in 1912. He actually won the most delegates, and they refused to nominate him.
Right.
Once people are in power, they're not beyond, playing dirty tricks to keep it. And they don't want to see, if they can't co-opt a movement, there won't be a movement.
Yeah, and when we move further and further, towards that, entitlement economy where everything is basically brought to you by the government, right?
Right.
Between food and healthcare and everything else, these establishments or these movements that would try to rise up, they lose a lot of legs because the same people that are arguing for certain things are probably receiving food stamps on the other end, and not to mention that the media is not going to pick these things up, right? They gain legs for a week or two, and then everybody stops covering it. And then,
but the media has a vested interest in staying on the side of the establishment.
Absolutely.
That's where their advertisers are. That's where their access is to politicians. Look what happens when you have, for example, in England with UKIP, a groundswell movement. People don't want to belong to Europe. There's a legitimate reason for people who live in England that don't want to be part of the EU. And yet, as that campaign gains steam, and perhaps even won many of the local elections, what's the first thing that comes out, the first line of attack? Not whether being in Europe is a good thing or not, that they're racist. And, of course, no one wants to be called a racist, and no one wants to be associated with being a racist. So if you don't want to be in Europe, you're a racist. And that's very effective. And really, the two have nothing to do with each other. But, again, it's the same thing. If you don't like some of Obama's policies, you can be deemed a racist. And they'll do that. It doesn't have to be racist, whatever the word is. That's how they galvanize against anti-establishment movements. Communism, that was the big, if you were for something in the 50s that went against the establishment, you're a communist.
Right.
Even if you weren't a communist, you're a communist. Racist, whatever the word is, they will use those terms and labels incessantly until nobody wants to be associated with that movement.
And the interesting part is that everybody should be against the establishment at this point, right? Everybody should.
People are more worried about being called communist, racist, teabagger, whatever it is, whatever the phrase is, than to be in favor of their own self-interest. Because their own self-interest is not to be associated with being called. I remember back in the 80s, it was being a liberal. You don't want to be called a liberal. Now it's racist, teabagger, whatever it is. There's always a way that they can knock you back down by labeling you for being against something that you legitimately can be against, and normal, rational, sane people who aren't racist, aren't communist, aren't liberals, aren't teabaggers, could be in favor of.
Well, and you're right. You could argue two sides to every point, which is what happens. But at some point, can there not be both parties agree that this is utter chaos and a disaster that's taking place right now?
Not if they're benefiting from it. They're not going to admit that.
Okay, but
if somebody wants to point that out, then they're going to start labeling them.
Well, at what point does the general public, who is feeling the effects of what's taking place at the higher level, right?
Brian, the general public is prone to slogans, hope and change, right?
That's true. Yeah, so they're hoping for an increase in their benefits, is what you're saying.
Whatever it is, Ryan, if you think about it, if you've seen these videos where people ask, why do you support this? What is this position? They don't know. Most people, when they vote, they vote based on 2 minutes of hearing something, and that's about it.
No, you're right, because they base it on Reuters' latest headlines, right?
Well, whatever party they happen to be in or what their neighbor told them, it's not based on an understanding of politics and economics. It's an emotional or even a non-thinking act to vote.
Yeah, and
because a lot of people will vote for Hilary Clinton just because she's a woman.
And that's exactly what will happen.
Of course.
And not just because she's a woman, because she's Bill Clinton's wife.
Well, absolutely.
Right? I mean, it's not going to be based upon what she actually plans on.
They're not going to listen about Benghazi. They're not going to want to know about any of that stuff.
We've already forgotten about Benghazi. Are you kidding me? Like, that was gone months
and
ago.
again, Benghazi is only an issue if the press wants to make it an issue, just like Watergate.
Correct.
Watergate, there was something there. If the press had decided to leave it alone, wouldn't have been a big deal. Not that I'm not saying that. I'm not trying to minimize what happened. I'm just saying is any of the things that a president is involved in, Fast and Furious, whatever it is, if the press wants to harp on it and spend all their time on it, it will be a big deal because just like any of these news stories you hear, Trayvon Martin was a big story because the press caught hold of it.
Right.
There are incidents that occur across the country very similar or worse than that, and they don't get the attention, so they fade away.
Well, that's
how important it is. That media attention is probably the most important thing, and controlling that narrative.
Correct. Well, at least there's one thing that I can tell you will remain constant with this show, Louis, will be that I won't change my stance on what the Fed's doing and what Congress and everybody else, this master plan that they feel can somehow be sustainable, because at some point it can't. I don't know when that time is going to come, but I'm going to stick to my narrative. You know what I mean? For many of the people out there that listen to our podcast, realize that obviously there's still opportunities that are out there. Obviously, there's a lot of bad situations for a lot of people, but there are some opportunities that are brought about by QE and by the tapering and loosening of guidelines and all that. So it is important that we get the information out there for the people that can take advantage of certain things. But understanding these macroeconomic things, the policies, what the Fed's doing, is a key component, I feel, into trying to position yourself the best you can for the future.
Right.
And really that's my whole intentions with this show is that I obviously care about my family as well, and I'm trying to position myself to take advantage of what the Fed is going to do or not going to do. And unfortunately, that's where we're at today. But the majority of people, I promise you, are paying no attention to what the Fed's doing.
Or even know what it is.
Or what it is. They're not questioning why we have the interest rate environment that we have right now. They're not questioning why we have the employment situation we have right now. These are all things that people should be thinking about, and I'm just challenging you guys at the end of the show, but to actually look and do your own research and see where we're at, look at the real numbers, and ask yourself if we're really in a better place. Where I don't think we are. I think that we're in a much worse place. That doesn't take away the fact that we still have interest rates that are sub 4%, but the numbers tell us that there's a small majority of people that are able to take advantage of those. And the only thing that you can really do now is to try to position yourself so that maybe you can take advantage of them in the next year or so. Mm-hmm. And if you're able to, and you can take advantage of them 3 times, if you can buy a primary residence, a second home, an investment property, and get 4% on all of those properties, then good for you. That's fantastic. I think that you're going to be set up long term to be in a good spot. For those of you that don't have jobs, I don't really have an answer for you, other than don't wait for the government or the Fed to fix that problem anytime soon, right? You're going to have to be responsible for yourself, and whether it's creating a business on your own, these are things that you're going to have to think about. But the employment situation between healthcare costs, with the inflationary pressures that we have on food and energy, all of these things are working against you right now. And the corporate employers are not going to change their tune anytime soon.
What's unfortunate, Ryan, with the corporate employers? I saw a survey that almost 98% won't even look at somebody who's been out of work 6 months.
It's crazy, right?
Totally crazy. Which means they don't really have the need for many employees, because if they had the need, obviously they'd run through the first ones that are only out of work or have jobs, and then eventually you'd have to hit the next pool of people that are out of work 6 months.
And how demoralizing is that for somebody that's coming out of college that basically doesn't even get a look because they just got out of school and they haven't had a job for the last 6 months. You know what I mean?
Right.
Why
not give up looking for work? That is what's happening.
And where are they forced back to? They're forced right back to school where they came from, and only to get more of an education to still have the same problem when they come back out the second time. So the reality is what everybody's telling you. I always tell people whatever people the majority of people tell you to do, you should just do the opposite. most of the time you'll be somewhat successful if you just go the opposite direction as what your friends, family members, and everybody else tells you to do.
Actually, do what you think you should do. It's probably, they see people that go with their guts and their hearts and do what they want to do better than do what they're told to do.
Absolutely. And, just don't think that because you have some sort of idea that everybody else considers dumb, it's not necessarily dumb. It's just dumb because they just don't see it from the view that you do. I mean, most people
it's easy to criticize. It's harder to do. So, kudos to the people who go out and do stuff.
And action is always better than inaction.
Yep. Action brings good fortune, in the words of Pink Floyd.
I agree with that 100%. So we'll end on that quote, Louis. I want to thank you for coming on. If you'll give us, if you'll give our listeners your website where they can check out your weekly blog.
Sure, thanks, Ryan. Smallgold.com. If you go there, there's an article or two each week on the Fed, gold, silver, real estate, the economy. So please check it out at smallgold.com.
Thanks, Louis.
Thanks, Ryan.
Thanks, guys, for tuning in. If you'd like to ask a question on our website, go to realestate360live.com. Also download, subscribe, share our podcast on iTunes. Search Real Estate 360. Until next time, guys, take care.